This is a second one, that a corollary to the one we just did, and it's going to be a much quicker video because it's just answering really one question that my friend Dr. Peter Guinther, after looking at these videos, he asked this question. It's hard to believe that these new discoveries on the coin haven't been brought up prior to now, especially by archaeologists and numismatists. I don't know how to pronounce that. Numismatists. I guess archaeologists don't do much with polemics, and especially with the whole historical character. And that's a good question, Peter, because stop and think. When I came across these coins, I had to go back and I had to find out, because I'm not a numismatist, I'm not an expert on coins, but people like Dr. Clive Foss and Dr. Mike Markowitz and others, but these are the two that I came across first, and that's why I went to go to them, because Clive Foss is an expert in this field, and that's why I used him. He is a numismatist, and others who have now responded on the sections below, especially the comments, who have been numismatists, who have come back, and I've gone through some of their material. They are experts in coins. And what is fascinating, when I read what Clive Foss was doing, he was putting coin after coin after coin. He was looking through the sequence of these coins, and the only thing he could do was actually try to put it into what he knew already about Islam. And the difficulty with him is that he's only ever been given one narrative. And that's the problem with the archaeologists. That's the problem with the numismatists. That's the problem with all of us. We have only ever had one narrative, and that narrative is what Islam has really imposed on us. It really has been imposed, and it's what you find, the only narrative you're going to find in all our schools, in all our universities, in our Bible schools, our seminaries, in every madrasa, you name it. There has only ever been one narrative, and that is the Islamic tradition. From the Islamic traditions that were introduced by people like Ibn Hisham in 833, by al-Waqidi in 835, others like the Hadith by al-Bukhari in 870, and Sahih Muslim in 875, others like the histories and the commentaries, al-Tabari in 923. So you're seeing all of these traditions that we have been dependent on to give us a history of what has happened back in the 7th century are only written down in the 9th and 10th century. And that's the problem. And that's the only one we've ever been given. There has been no critical analysis of those traditions until now. And there's been no reason to, because there's nothing really from the 7th century that we could look at. We only really could argue from an argument of silence, and that's the difficulty. It's always been an argument of silence, and that's the weakest kind of argument to argue for. In fact, I remember when I started introducing this way back in 1995, in my first debate with Dr. Jamal Balawi in 1995, one of the major comebacks was the Islamic traditions is the classical tradition. No one's ever, until you brought it up, no one's really ever tried to reject it. And that was 25 years ago that I brought this up. So I've been having to work with this, and always what the comeback was, you can only argue from silence. You're only arguing from silence. There's nothing there that you can point to. You just know that there's a problem, but there's no solution other than to go back to these traditions. And that's true. All I have had is an argument from silence. So when Clive Ross and Markowitz came across these coins, and this is their area of expertise, and Clive Ross is considered to be one of the world authority on these coins. And this article is just a summation of it, written in 2015, Aramco World. Fascinating. The only thing he could go to try to understand why these coins all had crosses on them and why they all had these Zoroastrian fire altars is because they were under the power of those two great empires. Without even thinking through, how could you be under the power of the Persian Zoroastrians when you had completely decimated them? You decimated them by 651. There was no Persian Empire anymore. The Sassanids no longer exist. Go to any history book and you'll find they no longer exist after 651. So who decimated them? Who took over? Well, just look and see what all the history books say. Islam took over. It's the Muslims that took over it. Well, if that is the case, then why you have 10 years later in 661, Muawiyah, who is still reproducing these fire altars with Khosrow's second image on it. Khosrow II was a king, one of the greatest king of the Sassanid Empire. He died in 628. What's he doing in 661 still putting his image on it? See, you really have to kind of stop and think. We just don't know how. I can understand why Clive Foss didn't know what to do with this. He just assumed that, well, these Arabs, these Muslims were still under the control of the Sassanians. What thinking, that doesn't make sense. The Sassanids, really, Khosrow II was the last great Sassanian emperor, and he died in 628. That's even before Muhammad died. So from 628 up until 661, who was now controlling? It was the Arabs who were controlling. It was the Arabs who were creating these coins. That's why they have Arabic on it. And it was these Arabs who still are using Zoroastrian icons. Nothing Islamic about anything on their coins, which suggests to me they were still Zoroastrian. And yes, they now controlled and they destroyed and they took over the Persians. That's true. The Persians no longer in control. They were in control, but they were very much Zoroastrian. So they still were Zoroastrian, at least in the eastern part. In the western part, they were still Christians. So why is it that the archaeologists and the numismatists have a problem? Because they're looking at the wrong narrative. We have always been said, and everybody said, Jay, you're arguing from an argument of silence. No, we're not. Not after these coins. These are no longer silent. We're not arguing from the arguments of silence. But we're not just talking about these coins. We're also talking about the maps. Take a look at the maps. There is no reference in any of the maps that support what the Islamic traditions are telling us. There is no Mecca on any of these maps until the 900s. Look at all the mosques. Take a look at all the mosques. Archaeologically speaking, all the mosques are facing the wrong direction. They're all facing too far north. They're all facing Petra. Take a look at the documentary evidence, the manuscript evidence, what Dan Brubaker has been coming across. Now, I mean, there's so much evidence that is now there in the 7th century that shows that there was no manuscript evidence for any Quran, and the only Qurans that we finally are starting to look at are from the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. They are not complete. They don't agree with each other, and they don't agree with the Quran we have today. So when you look at the numismatic evidence, that's the coins. When you look at the archaeological evidence, that's the mosques. When you look at the archaeological evidence, which are the maps, when you look at all the manuscript evidence, the documentary evidence, that's the manuscripts. In every case, you can see evidence is now coming. We're no longer arguing from silence. In fact, I would say it's just been flipped. It's now the Islamic traditions, the narrative that we've all had to go back, the one who the Clive Rosses and the Markowitz and all the others who have always gone back to as their default to fall back to understand what these coins are saying or to understand whatever is happening in the 7th century. I would suggest that those who are supporting the classical narrative, those who are supporting the Islamic traditions to understand how Islam began, they are arguing from silence. And I say to those people who support that classical narrative, you now have to come up with evidence. We've found the evidence. Where is your evidence? Suddenly the shoe has turned. And now no longer we have been blamed for arguing from silence. Now I'm saying that you're arguing from silence. Show us, prove to us that the story you've been looking at, that you've been teaching us, that you've been saying has been correct for 1,400 years, is no longer 1,400 years. It's only 1,200 years. And that history that's been redacted back from the 9th and 10th century is the wrong history and has no evidence to support it. Not on the ground, not with archaeology, not on the coins, not on the protocols, not on the manuscripts. In every case, it looks like all the evidence is pointing to a completely new narrative, which suggests that there was no Islam in the 7th century until al-Malik introduces it in 692. God bless you. It's been so good to be able to interact with you. I have one more video I'm going to do tonight, and then we're going to call it a day. But this has been great. Jay here.